Um, a lot of it, I think, I was doing regular furniture right out of graduate school and in graduate school. Um, the stuff that I'm doing now really came about after I started teaching. About 5 years into teaching, I was asked to teach a two-dimensional design class, and up until then I hadn't really been doing that. I'd been teaching jewelry, three-dimensional design, and general crafts, everything related to form and 3D. And I had absolutely no idea what I was going to do for this class, and I got a hold of a couple of books related to they're the classic textbook for introduction to art, and started looking at the way they had very similar characteristics in terms of the way they divided up everything, and so categories and stuff, and so I started looking at the 2D part and seeing that they basically dealt with and surprisingly enough, these books, really the majority of it dealt with imagery, not too much in terms of form, so to speak. I mean, they spent a lot of time on painting and drawing and stuff like that. So I started looking at what was in the content of that book and trying to form a curriculum related to that. And at the same time, I was teaching 3D also. And it really brought up this question of the relationship between 2D and 3D. Got into all kinds of areas in relationship to perception, physiology, as well as psychology and so on. And realized that there was really an interesting thing going on between the two areas, that they were not alike. One was a representation, one was a real world, and especially when it came to teaching. And I really developed an interest in perspective, and because it was the representation of reality, of the three-dimensional form. And just started questioning that. One afternoon in the studio, I started playing around with some cardboard things and cutting out these little areas, and I created this little table as a start that combined three-dimensional form and two-dimensional imagery, just these little H shapes. And it ended up being a table that had a top that was a parallelogram, because if you look at any square or rectangular surface at an angle, it becomes a parallelogram. And it combined false joinery. I had a through mortise and tenon that was actually just inlaid, as well as a real mortise and tenon that connected these two H shapes together, and then ended up being a table. And there were some anomalies in it visually, but surprising how many people really don't understand perspective. I tell students, if you can get perspective about 70% right, people really don't question it. And so it really moved on from there, and a lot of the inspiration came from imagery as opposed to form. And I was looking at all kinds of different imagery. One of the bits of imagery that I was looking at came from a cartoon that I had taken a 35 millimeter from. It's a piece called Olive's Chair. And then I started looking at Tonnet, or I guess some people say Thonet catalogs, and just copying the imagery from them and trying to make these pieces that later, and I guess other people have said this term, I don't think I'm the originator of it, they were essentially 2.5 dimensional. Lived in this area between 3D and 2D. And it was, I thought, a really rich field, and I've been doing it ever since, and I don't know if it'll ever stop, because there's always something new that I can come up with, always something that I can deal with related to this. And it's really an interesting area that exists somewhere between 2 and 3 dimensions. And a lot of the earlier stuff really wouldn't work. It wouldn't function. Some of them I tried to make function. but they didn't work. You could only see them from one point of view, and they would look correct. And I was at first sort of upset that once you moved away from that point of view, they started to become distorted. And I've literally had people say that as they walked around them, they started feeling queasy or sick. And I said, whoa, that's pretty interactive. I mean, that's pretty interesting that you can make something that will click when you stand in the right position, and as you move around it, will start to distort in really unusual ways. About 2-3 years, well, who knows, I can't remember how many years. There were a lot of things that happened. I had some client that was a guy in Washington who came over one day and said, "You show me some drawings." And I said, and he said, "What do you want to make?" And I said, "Well, I'm interested in making this and this." And he said, "Go ahead and make them. Buy, you know." I sold him a couple of 2 or 3 pieces, and that helped me along. But things really didn't happen a lot. I was teaching at this time, and I couldn't put a lot of time in it. But I was eventually invited to a show. Before we were so rudely interrupted. I was invited to a show at the Museum of Art. I believe that's the correct name for it. They don't even have, it's not even called the Boston Museum. I think it's just simply the Museum of Art in Boston. And they have a large collection of furniture, and what they wanted us to do, I thought was a really good idea, was to do a spin-off of one of the pieces that was in their collection. So we spent about 3 days or 2 days just wandering around the museum in the back rooms, looking at, and in the galleries, looking at all these different pieces of furniture and pulling out drawers and stuff like that. And so I asked them if I could get the official picture for this John Townsend chest on chest. And I knew that I would really work from the image more than anything else. So they handed me this nice glossy photo of the piece. And I had been working with this, a piece of furniture that was just a series of crates, and I was going to use corian so that they looked like marble blocks. And I was trying to work with the corian. It wasn't working. It wasn't gluing very well. It just was really a bad idea. So I converted over to making these crates out of Sitka spruce, and I made them real fancy. I called it designer crates. And it's a large chest with several drawers in it that appears to look like blocks, but it really is just a facade. The drawers pull out the drawers are actually parallelograms, and they pull out at an angle. My original idea was to take the corian and carve it so that the chest looked like it was made out of marble. And since a lot of the design elements were, from classical Greek architecture. So that blew away the whole idea. I didn't know what I was going to do for the show. And then I realized I had these crates. And then I realized that I could open them up, and I could put the pieces of furniture or elements of the furniture inside the crates so that they almost looked like it was a whole chest, but it was all segmented. And that, to some degree, came out of the idea that you look at a Chippendale catalog and you can find a finial here and a facade there and a crown molding there, and that's what the catalog was about, was letting the client organize all these things together, a different kind of leg. And in fact, if you take a look at the catalog, you'll see a left leg is different from the right leg, and so on. So I thought that was a good idea. I thought the show was going to be a very important show, and so I really took on something that was pretty ambitious. But I had had some experience in terms of building the carcass and the drawers and figuring out how to put them all together, and it ended up being a big success in terms of the show. And it literally looks like a stack of crates, but if you look closely, some of them are open, some of them are closed, but there is the form of the highboy, or chest on chest, inside there. One of the things that happened was, oh man, there's a lot I can do with these chests, these crates stacked on one another. And one of the next things I did was, because of my interest in Japanese block prints and the fact that I think I had done some block prints related pieces before this, I said, why not try to do a wave crashing through these crates? And so I took the Great Wave of Kanagawa, I think that's the name of it, the Hokusai piece, the classic image that you see all over. I used that, and I think I pulled it off. It was really an interesting piece to see this wave. A lot of it had to do with the wave itself being made out, or the crates being made out of Sitka spruce, which was very linear and very crate-like looking, and then the wave I made out of 2 different kinds of maple, and I bleached some of it to make it the foam, and then the wave itself, I used a quilted maple and dyed it blue, and it really looks like a wave. It really has this quality of water. For some people, it might be hard to think about dyeing wood blue, but it worked. There's a word for it that the French have. The English pronunciation would be chatoyance. I don't know if a lot of people don't know this word.
I didn't know it.
Yeah, if you're going to say it in French, it's chatoyance, and they use that to describe silks and or like a star sapphire. And all of us woodworkers know that maples and some teaks have that very reflective quality to it, especially when they're oiled. And I knew that that would happen. And so then people were interested in it. I sold the chest, the original chest, at the museum in Boston. And then the Smithsonian was interested in one, and I did one that was called Ghost Boy that was broken up even more. And somebody after the fact said, well, you know, that's really cubism. And yeah, you're right, it is, I guess. And so I pushed the cubism idea a little bit further with Ghost Boy in terms of repeating elements and not making it look like a specific crate inside, or a specific piece of furniture inside of these crates. It got very much more segmented. That had probably been percolating for years, because there was a show in L.A. at the L.A. County Museum, a huge show that was curated. It has a nice catalog. It's called, oh gosh, let me think, what's the name of it? It's books over there. When Art Became Fashion. And they had a lot of kimonos that were very, very old. I think they had some even 16th century. They certainly had a few 17th century kimonos. And when you think about fabric being that old, it's pretty amazing that they had them. Only the Japanese could conserve them. The show was very dark because they didn't want any light, and they actually divided it up into 2 sections so that none of the pieces were up for a very long time. And I just went nuts. And more than that, I reacted to the fact that they had a nice catalog and could go through it. And I thought that their design was way ahead of its time in terms of a contemporary composition. And I just really liked the idea of the kimono on the armature with the arms spread out, and then you're looking at the back, and then you see the front of the kimono wrapped around, and it makes this interesting triangular shape. And I really just got into the pure composition of that.
You love the shape.
Yeah, and compositionally, when you consider what they're doing with this odd shape, and then, you know, in Western art, you know, the big deal was, here's this rectangle or this square, and they're composing within that. You're going, oh man, that's nothing. Try to compose within the shape of this kimono, and it's much more interesting. So it really became a pure two-dimensional situation, although the great thing about it is I had the opportunity of making that kimono into a cabinet form, albeit a little marginal in terms of how much volume you have inside there, but it allowed it to stand up and move itself away from the wall, and it was just a whole area to explore. I mean, I actually have done 3 series now related to them, and probably more of this one type of piece. I think I've done 13 or 15 of them, more than any other piece of furniture. Well, the first one was based pretty much on imagery that was that I found in that catalog, and reorganized it, but very much Japanese. Some of the stuff I pulled out of screens that I had seen and other Japanese block prints and put them together, trying to maintain their basic composition. And in this book, they actually go from period to period and show you how the compositions, the major elements of the compositions changed or stayed the same, or so on and so forth. And calligraphy, and landscape scenes, and just all kinds of different areas that these kimonos were about. The second series, I got a little bit more involved in my own imagery and started combining crazy things like I had been doing a series of chairs that had steam pipes and steam coming out of them, so I did a kimono using that with still the Japanese compositional kind of quality. I did another piece called, what's the name of the one with the, what did I call it? Anyway, it was a plane and the wood chips, Mr. Chips, it's called Mr. Chips, with the wood chips falling down. And it was like combining contemporary cartoons with the sensibility of the Japanese design elements and composition. And in that particular one, there's a checkerboard in the back, which surprisingly enough is a motif that the Japanese use quite a bit. There were quite a few kimonos, very old ones, that had checkerboards in them. And then this third series, well, in the second series I did one called Kimono That Built Itself, and really started playing on introducing the an American aspect to it, a cross-cultural thing. Another one was related to elements that I found in Popeye cartoon. The cartoon is called Bluto's Diner, and so it's a bunch of plates and pots and pans and a big cleaver and cups and so on these boards. And I really like the idea of putting the two crazy elements together. And then this third series that isn't produced yet, I haven't really put them out there, has to do with the war in Iraq. And I found another book, and it was called Wearing Propaganda, and it had kimonos from the 30s and the 40s that were very much propaganda related to the Japanese war efforts that started with China and so on and so forth. It was a little edgy. I was a little concerned about that situation, but I couldn't help but like the idea of putting an airplane on a kimono, and blimps, and most of them do have airplanes, and I guess it's just a fascination with airplanes and the imagery, especially airplanes as they apply to the 30s and the 40s, the quality that they had and so on. If you work with tools, I mean, a lot of craftsmen collect them. I don't have the money or the desire to collect anything. I can't organize anything in any kind of a collection, but I really do appreciate them. I really like working with them, and you can get a book with images of tools in them, and that's great. You look through them, but I really got fascinated with drawing them and inlaying them. Again, because I could make this metal plane, this large plane made out of maple, and bleach it, and it'll look exactly like the metal, the shiny metal of a plane. And I'm interested in the old ones. So I thought of this, I did a chair that was called Furniture That Builds Itself, and it's just these tools sort of suspended and looking like they're affecting the wood as it's being built. A plane with a big thing a big strip of wood coming out of it, and a screwdriver screwing in a screw and stuff like that. And I thought that was successful, but I wanted them to be held by a hand. I wanted that relationship. And a human hand, trying to inlay this image of a human hand, I didn't think would work. So I said, well, I'll go to the cartoon hand, and that the bandy arms, the black arm that Mickey Mouse has, that is associated most of the time with that white glove, really I thought was interesting to bring into the work, having black in it. Well, if you take a look at a cartoon, it's basically a Japanese block print, but it's just got different imagery. And the idea of a black line with you know, a shape that defines it, just really, they're really one and the same. And the block prints, the technique that I use in terms of cutting out the wood and then having a line in between it is, you know, really lends itself to the block print or cartoon imagery. And so that's where I was looking for ideas. Well, it was just, there was all this available to you in terms of the image. Like I say in that one kimono that builds itself, all of the stuff in the background of the cartoon was available there, and it was just so much fun to redraw a pitcher or a cup. Or in New York, I walked into a store that sold restaurant supply plates and stuff, and I took like 100 pictures in there of plates stacked up, of teapots, of little tiny teapots that you can get at the diner, and you know, cleavers and all of that stuff, and it was just great to draw them and introduce them in so many different ways into, in this case, I really thought the opposition of sensibility between a cartoon and a kimono was just really a great idea. Getting back to the glove thing, the white hand thing, and I didn't know this, I didn't realize it. I guess subliminally knew it, but there was a guy from Australia that had been to Japan several times, came over, and he borrowed the kimono that built itself, which has one, I believe, just one arm with a white hand working a plane in it, and he saw the other stuff and he started laughing. I said, well, what's so funny? He says, well, in Japan, everybody wears white gloves. The street sweeper wears a white glove as he sweeps, and he says all the girls in the department stores that are at the escalators, they have white gloves on. They wear white gloves constantly in Japan. And I started thinking, oh, that's really a funny thing. It's a crack up to think about that you can make that association, which was never really intended. Yeah, I'm really interested in making the titles work.
What do you play with?
Yeah, it's like I'm doing a piece right now that has a dollar bill. It's a huge dollar bill that's going to be a chest of drawers. And to define the drawers and make them work, I'm wrapping it with a big rope. So it's really bound up by a lot of rope. And I was having a hard time figuring out names for these pieces. And one of the things that I do is I go back and I start looking at Magritte. I'm really interested in Rene Magritte, and I think really is a big inspiration for a lot of the work that I do. And he has great titles. You know, his classic, probably most famous painting, the one, and surprisingly enough, we have it here in LA, is the name of the painting is called Treachery of Images. And it's the one with it has the pipe that says, "This is not a pipe." And so in this particular group, I went, oh, okay, Magritte, why don't I call this group of pieces Treachery of of an economy, because it has to do with the dollar bill and what we've done to it, so to speak. And so this one chest of drawers, as I said, has the rope wrapped around it, and I started thinking, oh, okay, let's get real sort of esoteric. That drawer, that chest of drawers, is going to be called The Fate of Discretionary Income. And I thought that that's really appropriate. It really gives you an idea of what's happening here. I have another piece that's a bench, a sort of between a bench and a chair, with a huge pair of scissors cutting a dollar bill in half, and that's where treachery of an economy came from. I have one with George Washington, and I haven't done this yet. I've got the piece completed, but the portrait of George didn't come out quite the way I wanted to. He looked a little puffy, and the guy Gary, that works up front in an office up front, said he looks a little beat up, and he goes, oh, he said, yeah, that's it. He's got a black eye, so we're going to stain a black eye and put a Band-Aid on him, and we're going to call that George's Beatdown. And then I've got another chair that has that's the dollar bill is burning up, and I might end up calling that Burned at the Cross. I'm not sure. So the names are interesting. Some of them, refer to. I did a series of pieces that relates to the kimono one called Furniture That Builds Itself, and there's some pretty crazy names in that, like Drilling in the Sea of Japan, and what is it, Stanley Brothers Under Glass, referring to the Stanley Plains. And then there was another Stanley one that I can't. Oh, hydroplaning in the Sea of Japan with the Stanley Brothers. So they can get quite nutty sometimes, but you can't help it. That's what happens with them. Well, one of the things that you and I have discussed was the fact that, and you put it to me, that why are you even making furniture? I mean, these things are flat surfaces and paintings, and I want them to work, and I think that the furniture part of it is very important for them to, that they are something that you can interact with, that function. To what degree, I'm not sure. But, I do think that, for instance, a lot of the chest of drawers work just as well as any other chest of drawer. But if you really want to get into this, again, it goes back to Magritte. And if you take a look at that famous painting, he needs this disclaimer underneath it that says, this is not a pipe. He needs words to describe what he wants to convey in terms of the concept. And so I think I'm working in a relationship or dealing with some of the very same things that Magritte is doing. People ask them, well, wait a second, this is not a pipe, it is a pipe. And he goes, well, wait a second, can you put a tobacco in it and can you smoke it? And then they say no, and then he returns with, well, then it's not a pipe. And more precisely, it's an image of a pipe. And I think that if you talk to any contemporary artists that are living today and you ask them the 10 most influential artists that they've come across in history, and I think they would say Magritte. And if you look at Jasper Johns, you look at all of these guys, they are doing what Magritte did 60 years ago, or were inspired by him. So getting back to this idea of function, that painting is about function then to some degree. And so now you have a piece of furniture that does function, but at the same level, it has aspects of it that, you're not sure relate to furniture. So is it a piece of furniture or is it not a piece of furniture? And there are a lot of things that I bring into the work that aren't related to furniture, but I love the form, the idea, the limitation that this thing has to be a chair or it has to have some drawers that pull out. and it really is a driving force for eventually what I do, where I come up with ideas and so on. I like the difficult aspect of the reality of the piece, which means it has to be some drawers, has to be a cabinet, the drawers have to pull out, and at the same time it has an image of a series of crates with a wave crashing through it. And, how do you get those two things to work? And I think that that's a really interesting intellectual challenge. The big problem with it nowadays is that if you come from way outside, not aware of what is happening out there, there's so many avenues that you can go to. One of the problems is well, then you ask that question, and then, well, okay, do you want to design furniture that will be manufactured? Do you want to design furniture that's limited production? Do you want to be actively involved in actually making the furniture? Do you want to be involved with clients and do custom furniture? It's endless. And one of the things that I kept on doing was thinking about all those aspects, those traditional aspects of, well, maybe I'll end up doing some limited production furniture. And sometimes I come across an idea and I think, well, I'm going to start trying to do this limited production stuff. And I go, no, I'm not having much more fun doing this other thing. And a few years back when I started this thing, I got involved with the gallery, and luckily enough, and this has nothing to do with making a living, luckily enough, I was able to work for 2 years, put on a show, and sell the stuff, which allowed me to work for another 2 years to put on a show and sell the stuff. And so there's no path. And one of the things that happened early on with me was that when I was at Long Beach, at the end of the semester, these trailers would pull onto the campus. And I'm going, what's that about? And then I found out that, well, that is a trailer that was rented by a large engineering firm that would come onto the campus, and they would interview students that were graduating for an engineering job. And that was in engineering, it was in electrical, it was in chemistry, it was all of the sciences and so on and so forth. And there wasn't a trailer that pulled up to the art department. That just didn't happen. And so you really have to, if you're creative, you have to be creative about your path and how you get there, because there's a million different ways to get there. And the minute you say, well, I'm going to do limited production furniture, or I'm going to specifically do this, or I'm going to follow the way David Savage is doing it, then you're stuck. You've really got to figure out your own path. And admittedly, one of the things that I did was I made the realization that if I wanted to keep doing goofy things, I had to have a stream of income. And I found that teaching, and I taught for 32 years, was one of the ways of allowing myself to be able to do both. And then, now that I'm retired, it's great because I can do anything I want, and I'm doing it all the time, which is nice to be in, a nice position to be in. I'm not looking past September too much because I'm just way too preoccupied with what I'm doing now. I do have this group of the propaganda pieces that I have to think about finishing up, and I don't know what I'm going to do with those at this point. But I'll probably back off and start working on some small pieces. I don't think you've even seen any of the trays that I've been doing. They were just something that I could do very quickly and sell at a relatively, reasonable price. But it's funny because they eventually turned into the group of pieces that it's called This Is Not Lunch. And that reminds me, you don't have any of those.
Thank you, John.
Is that
fantastic?
Okay.